Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give a minute. I know people are still coming in and it's not quite 2:30. So good afternoon, everyone. We are here today to talk about Kindly Hire Me, the process and impact of inclusive hiring. I'm Annie Bélanger. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm the Dean of University Libraries at Grand Valley State, and I'm joined today by...
Hi, I'm Preethi Gorecki. I'm the communication librarian over at MacEwan University, all the way up in Edmonton, Canada.
Perfect. This presentation today is going to explore perspective on inclusive hiring practices from both sides of the table. Grand Valley State University Library conducted its first diversity residency search in the summer of 2018, which integrated recently developed inclusive recruitment and high empathy hiring. I served as the search committee, and one of the successful residency candidates was Preethi Gorecki. And so we're really going to sort of dissect the hiring process from both of our perspective. We're going to talk about the work behind critically examining our hiring processes, designing an inclusive recruitment plan, and implementing a structure to ensure that empathy to applicants actually is centered throughout our process. And then Preethi is also going to talk about the impact of inclusive hiring on perceptions of the work environment, satisfaction with the search, and overall experience of the hiring process, as well as lessons learned since her time at Grand Valley. And then we're going to dig into a very brief toolkit. So the first part is a journey to hiring with heart, a process overview. And so really here we were talking about how do we bring and center empathy and kindness in that hiring process. So first, why high empathy and kind hiring? Our professional values as librarians and as library professionals, and also our core principles, are meant to inform our practice. And so how would that look if we actually took those values and working principles into our realm of recruitment? How might it change our hiring practices was the premise of our efforts early on. In particular, I wanted to consider the intersection of diversity, lifelong learning, user-centered practices, empathy, and respect. And I also then asked, what if we were to bring the compassion and empathy that we bring to our users, to our candidates and colleagues? What if our recruitment processes could move from a grueling challenge where only the worthy may be left standing at the end to a learning opportunity for all? And so in my premise is that we have a social responsibility to the profession to help each other learn what kind of librarian and library professional we want to be, and that we can do this through professional modeling of what a strong, confident library where informed risk-taking occurs and inclusion is woven right into the hiring process. We also wanted to center the needs of the candidates as we prepare for the day. So how can we challenge our habits and biases to ensure we're doing things that will truly inform our decisions and help us provide feedback to the candidate for their continued growth, whether or not they're selected? And so by rooting our processes in empathy and respect, we can remember that we're not only interviewing them, but that they are interviewing us too. We also remember that though job searches will always be stressful, we can do a lot to make it smoother and a healthy process for our candidates. So we can support our candidates in their retention in the profession, also by helping them in their journey by providing them constructive and meaningful feedback through a dialogue model. So we wanted to start at the start. So mindful ads, letting candidates know that they belong. And so in thinking about ads, particularly for entry level or new and career librarians, which includes diversity residencies, we want to be mindful of our bias. We want to examine the language used, and we'll get into a little bit more detail when we get to that toolkit at the end. We want to keep our number of qualification in checks, right? So stick to our must-haves or deal breakers. What is it that someone has to have to be successful in their first year versus what can they grow and learn? And so that's where looking for aptitude and quality of experience is more important than quantity of experience. I think many of us are aware that often in libraries, we advertise entry-level positions with a minimum of 3 to 5 years. And so years and that rigid approach to types of experience will often prevent us from hiring emerging talents and those that are outside of traditional pathways. The other aspect of it is that it can really, privilege begets privilege, and so it can further amplify and benefit those who have an existing amount of privilege. We also know studies have shown that many women won't apply for the job they don't 100% qualify for, and whereas men will often apply for a position they feel that they're 60% qualified for. And this also reverberates into our colleagues who are Black, Indigenous, or identify as people of color, as well as other non-dominant identities. As the hiring manager, it might be easy, or those of you, if you're supervising hiring manager, it might be easy to have an unending list of qualifications in mind. But in order to highlight your commitment to inclusion, it's important to really trim that list down. And instead of including all those nice to haves that a dream candidate might possess in the required qualification, really stick to those must haves and move those dream candidate qualifications into your preferred, and even then question whether or not it's required for someone to apply. If you'd still like to call out certain desired skill, you can soften the message with language like familiarity with, bonus points for, if you have any combination of these skills. And that said, it's still a good idea to cut down your long list no matter what. And so we also should state our inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility commitments right into our ads. Of course, often we have our employers put in their standard non-discrimination statement, but if your library in fact is striving and doing more than that, add it to the ad so that it's very clear and it's upfront. And then you can also invite questions and dialogue from applicants right away. So in transparency, we want to make sure that we have, as part of the interview process, high communication or transparency. You might recall from your own experiences that from the applicant side, the search process is often mysterious, lengthy, sometimes described as a black box. And so communication with candidates can really help ensure a smoother process and keep our applicants engaged. So we can do that by customizing communication. We could leverage templates so that the communications are even across different searches and across different candidates, but they're customized to the search at hand. We want to give opportunity to contact someone in the organization right away that establishes rapport and the willingness to engage with our candidates. We want to share information in our communication about where we're at in the process, the search committee, the organization. In many ways, we want to demystify communication and the process wherever we can. And so we've put together a quick timeline of timing the communications with candidates. So for phone interviews, scheduling and preparation, it's often important to express excitement for their candidacy. Search committee members, so their names and titles, but also the role on the committee, and for the members that are comfortable sharing their pronouns as a way to signal that we welcome that information as well. We should highlight the process and timeline. So where are we in the process? What's going to happen next? And what's the future steps should they move? So there's no benefit in keeping them in the dark. It really just helps to create anxiety for many. We should also articulate how to request accommodation. So if we're truly committed to inclusion and equity, we should be offering accessible interviews. And so actually offering that opportunity to flag those rather than having someone feel that right away they have to advocate or fight for them. And then you can share other things you need to know about us. So for example, I like to share our workplace principles, a link to our inclusion statement, and some of our recent efforts. I also state in that email that we'll send our questions ahead. We used to, at the time that Preethi was hired, we would share those an hour ahead. We've now moved the practice to be 24 hours ahead, acknowledging that someone who's currently in a job might not have the hour ahead of an interview free. And so we've tried to provide the same greater time, but it's important that we provide the same time to different candidates. So then before the campus interview scheduling, it's a good idea to build on our last message, but also share our agenda, but with focus statements. So why is each component of the interview there? And if there's evaluation criteria associated with them or who will be there, making that transparent so that people know what success might look like. We want to, again, that process and timeline overview, demystifying what can be demystified. State if you're going to pay for interviews and flights, and are you paying ahead? Are you doing some bookings for them? If there's an on-campus component to it, or any of those. And then again, how to request accommodation. And here, if there is food included, it's important to also request any food needs that they may have. Pre-visit, again, wanting to ensure that those candidates have food needs are shared or confirmed. If you're going to do pickup because it's an in-person interview, it's a good idea to share the license plate and the description of the vehicle, as well as the name of who will be picking them up. When we think about safety, it's important that they don't accidentally get in the wrong car. So we want to share questions for the search committee component ahead. And if there's a presentation topic, 2 weeks or at least 2 weekends ahead is a good rule of thumb for people to have enough time to prepare. And again, what are your evaluation criteria for your presentation, and who will be there are helpful components. At the selection stage, get permission to do reference check. I know that one sounds common sense, but sometimes we forget to do that step. And then at the offer call, hopefully you're able to express excitement for that offer, but also articulate how salary is set and if negotiations can occur. So at Grand Valley, we do not negotiate salary. However, I will give and I tell candidates this, I will give them the best salary that I can offer, and I'll explain how I went about setting their salary based on compression, market, and the range and years of experience. I also outlined the benefits. So what retirement, vacation, professional development, all of the different benefits they might have, provide a clear timeline for response and answer questions. I also follow up that phone call with an email that contains all of this information so that candidates who process better information by reading it are not disadvantaged by this high stress conversation, or what can feel like a high stress conversation for new hires. For non-selection, schedule a call to let them know they were not chosen before the announcement of your selected candidate happens. And I like to thank them for investing time in the search. And then because they've invested time in us, I'd like to offer feedback and invest back into them. And so I share what particular strengths we witnessed throughout the interview process, and then what areas of growth to be more competitive in the future. However, I do not share why they did not get the position, and I don't share anything that might have been considered a red flag by a search committee. That's where the legal department would get very anxious. So in thinking about your interview planning, we really want to invite intentionality and deliberate. So one of the leading practices is to actually plan everything ahead of candidate reviews so that you're not inadvertently swayed by the information that candidates have shared with you, particularly if any candidate is known to you, which can occur in the library profession. We anchor the questions to job qualifications to make sure that between the questions and the different interview components, we've covered all the required qualifications. There's nothing worse than getting to the debrief at the end and realizing there's an area of the job you simply didn't explore. We then define success criteria for each question. These are the concepts that a successful answer would touch upon. So not what the correct answer is, but what components would it include? So for example, actually we'll get to that in the hiring toolkit. So using open-ended question is really recommended. And so if it's an entry-level position, ask yourself, could someone without experience successfully answer it? And are you also asking it in a way that someone would need to know more about your organization than they should be able to find from your website? So really trying to think about where are the opportunities for very open-ended questions. And some of them can be as simple as changing language, right? So a very common question is, please tell me about a time that you successfully resolved the problem. Well, we already made that question a leading question. We could instead tell me about a time that you resolved the problem or that you faced the problem. And then one of the things that can be helpful, particularly with entry-level position, is to have some prompts that you plan that you don't ask unless someone's really struggling to get to the question. And some of them could be examples like, it's okay. Do you have an example from your graduate school or from non-library work experiences? So really trying to think about if you're that candidate in that moment, with the anxiety and possibly freezing, asking a prompt that doesn't tell them the answer, but that just helps them gain a footing or have something else to think about. Develop an assessment rubric for each of your component or for the overall component of the interview so that you can take notes and think about, did a candidate demonstrate something very well, demonstrated it somewhat, or did not demonstrate at all, as a very simple rubric. And then again, throughout your component, consider inclusions and accommodation. So for example, if it's winter and you're planning a walk around campus, you might want to be very clear with candidates that there could be bad weather, so that particularly female identifying candidates or non-binary candidates will also bring flats rather than have to have a possibly painful walk around campus or dangerous if it's icy. So again, challenging some of our habits as we interview with compassion. As I said, we want you to articulate each portion of the candidate. So, but also think about, why is it that the candidate needs to be there for that component? So does every librarian position require a presentation? What components are going to help you decide on core skills? If a presentation or portfolio is required, are you going to retain the material? Is the topic inadvertently asking for free labor? So many academic hiring processes are more grueling than other processes, and that's particularly true in North America. Some of this has become habitual when the norm is 1 to 2 or more days of interviewing. Building in the process space that allows a candidate to stay focused, energized, and connected is key if we want to be inclusive. And so if academic hiring is full of mystery and is a black box, we have a lot of power as hiring managers to change that. So we're doing that by sharing the questions with the candidate, lowering the need to request accommodations, as well as lowering candidate anxiety about the process. It allows for inclusion from the start. You want to get to know their skills and their strengths, not necessarily their ability to interview. And by developing those prompts, you can prepare for a candidate who struggles to answer questions up front, but has actually deep experience or aptitude. You can scaffold them to success, having the best interview that they can. Think about safety and comfort. Build in lots of breaks. State who'll pick them up. What do they look like? Do you have snacks in the room that they can take those breaks in? Is there extra water? All of those aspects. It's also important for library administration to set the tone for candidate experiences. So whether it's the hiring manager or others in administration engaging in the interview, we want to make them comfortable. We want to keep a pace that is reasonable. We don't want to have gotcha moments. And we also want to avoid inappropriate territory with candidate questions. So we want to keep questions to a reasonable level, but we also want to not, we don't want to ask the personal questions, particularly the ones that might inadvertently lead into legal hot water. So post-interview process, just digging a little bit deeper. I talked about making the offer. We want to schedule that time for the conversation. We want to include information beyond the salary and the start date, follow up with that email, a clear deadline for response, and then also offering follow-up times to connect with for further questions. And then supporting unselected candidates. We want to communicate quickly, offer feedback, highlight their strengths, provide tips how they can be more competitive, and engage in a brief supportive dialogue. Non-selected candidates can be your ambassadors for good in future searches. They might even apply in future searches, or having a negative experience, they can dissuade friends and colleagues from applying to your future searches. So a simple example of using this process, I did a dual associate dean search before, and 2 of the candidates, after unselected candidates, after having this feedback coaching call, actually sought multiple coaching calls. Now, that was my choice to continue to engage. I'm not recommending that that has to be for everyone. But one of the candidates actually followed up later on to say the process helped them identify what they wanted to do in leadership. And in fact, they became librarian adjacent and moved to the NSF. We also had a diversity resident realize after the process and the dialogue call that their passion really was in public libraries, and redirecting and thinking about their interview, how that would be helpful for them. And so over to Preethi.
Thanks, Annie. So in my section, I'm going to talk about my experience being hired through an inclusive hiring process. And then I'm also going to talk about my more recent experiences with job searches and talk about some of the aspects that were really positive and some of the ones that were not, in the hopes that it'll help you with your hiring processes and of what to do and what not to do. So the quote on this slide is actually something I said during my interview at GBSU. Thanks for not making me feel uncomfortable, because honestly, I felt like they went through so much effort to make that a reality. And most places will not do that. So I very much appreciated that. And then slide, thank you. So as Annie mentioned, the questions for the interviews are sent ahead of time, which was really helpful. So as Annie said, they've switched it to 24 hours before, but at the time that I interviewed at GBSU, it was 1 hour before, which was enough for me because I had a flexible work schedule at the time, so I was able to take that hour off. This gave me time to prepare for the interview and jot down some bullet points to touch on for each question. So I felt that this really helped me perform better in the phone interview, and it made me more comfortable throughout the process because I knew what I was going to be asked, and I knew I had some idea of how I might answer those questions. Even though I didn't fully flesh out every single answer, I at least had something to go on, so I wasn't just sitting there going, can you repeat the question? Which was really nice. And the questions felt really genuine, like the committee wanted to better understand me as a candidate and what I could bring to the table. And each interviewer repeated their name before asking questions. So this was a phone interview, right? So this was really important because I didn't always know who was asking me the question, and unless they said that was their name. So it was really nice because every time it was their turn to ask a question, they said, oh, by the way, this is Annie, this is this person. And so I always knew who was addressing me, and this reduced the ambiguity over who I was responding to and took the guesswork out of the equation. There was also time budgeted at the end for candidate questions, which I really appreciate because I have definitely had interviews where I have like 5 questions planned and there's 2 minutes for me to ask questions and there's no buffer between my time slot and the next candidate. So I get cut off and I don't get my chance to interview the interviewer, so to speak, and I don't get a good sense of where I'm going to be working potentially. So I really appreciate that they let me know that there was also a buffer time between the phone interviews scheduled. So I knew I had all the time I needed to ask all the questions I needed to ask. So ahead of the in-person interview, I received a lengthy email. And I think this is the longest email I've ever received during an interview process. But I was so appreciative of it because it included short biographies of the search committee and the names of all of the people I'd be interacting with during my interview day, as well as when I'd be interacting with them. A detailed itinerary that included addresses, links to menus, descriptions of the cars and the people who would be picking me up, times and locations for meetings and interview segments, and purpose statements for each segment of the interview. So for instance, like for the dinner part of the interview, which is always this ambiguous thing because you don't know what you're getting judged on at the dinner portion. There's not really a purpose for it. It's just supposed to introduce you to the city, give you a chance to get to know some of the people on your search committee. But it was really nice because on that itinerary, it said nothing will be judged during this time. This is for you to get to know us a bit better. Whereas like for the presentation portion, they wrote something such as like to evaluate the candidate's research and presentation skills for this purpose of the job, which I thought was really great because I knew exactly what I was getting judged on and why, which helped me prepare accordingly. It also included information about how the people at my interview dinner would be dressed. And this was so nice because it just completely took out the ambiguity of like how I should pack and what I should wear. So I was told, I think that someone on my search committee was going to be wearing Converse and sort of like business casual outfit. And I was like, that sounds great. I don't want to wear uncomfortable shoes anyway. And it also had questions about my dietary restrictions, which again is just really inclusive because I mean, I'm vegetarian now, I wasn't at the time, but if I had said that, I think it would have changed where they took me to dinner maybe, or it would have changed maybe where they took me to lunch, which was really great to give candidates that opportunity. questions about whether accessibility accommodations would be needed, which is obviously important because you want to make sure that your candidates are able to perform at the best of their ability and have everything that they need. I also, and this was actually probably one of my favorite parts of the interview, was I had various options to select from regarding how 90 minutes of my interview day would be spent. So the options I was given were a tour of the library from a student colleague, a tour of the Women's and Gender Equity Centers, meeting with the library's Inclusion and Equity Committee, or meeting with the campus's Inclusion and Equity Division staff. So for me, I actually chose to meet with the campus's Inclusion and Equity Division staff, which was actually really eye-opening, especially as like a person of color interviewing at a predominantly white institution. It was really nice to get to meet with those folks and talk to them about what's going on at an institutional level. What are we doing to drive change towards racial equity? What are we doing to make the campus more inclusive? And I got all of the answers I needed in that meeting to know that GBSU was going to be a really good fit for me. And also my presentation topic. So I'm going to go on a bit of a rant here, but it was theory-based rather than practice-based, which is so important because I always kind of cringe when I get practice-based interview questions because they're often fraught with institutional context that you do not have. And beyond that, it's asking you to do free labor. So I don't work for you yet. You're not paying me for this presentation. You're not paying me to consult for you. And yet you're asking me to basically consult for you if you're asking a practice-based question. So if you're asking something around the lines of, if you were given this much funding for this project, how would you go about allocating it? What kind of work would you do to put into that? I don't know that if you're not hiring me, you're not going to take my work and just run with it. So I really appreciated that it was a theory-based question. It also made it feel more genuine, like they were asking about, what I was, about what mattered to me and what my values were. So for my next slide, I'm going to talk about the candidate visit. No, it's okay, Annie. Sorry, I got a little distracted. So someone was assigned to guide me through the different parts of campus to ensure that each portion of my interview remained on schedule. So the guide checked on me in between each segment of the interview day to see if I needed private reflection time, washroom breaks, water breaks, and asked if I had any questions about the library or campus throughout the day. This was really nice because it made me feel like a human being. I think sometimes you just go to robot mode when you're doing these candidate visits and you're just like, okay, this thing, this thing, this thing, this thing, and it's all back to back. You don't get a break. You don't have time to just be a human being. But it was really nice, and being prompted for breaks made me feel like I could express my needs without being perceived as unenthusiastic or shy, which may have been the case if I had excused myself without being prompted. So like, for instance, if I was like, I just need like 2 minutes to myself, I don't know how that would have been taken if I wasn't prompted. So I really appreciated the opportunity to express my needs. The presentation was scheduled at the beginning of the interview day, which was the portion I was definitely the most nervous for. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get that out of the way first. Attendees were prepped for what is appropriate to ask following the presentation, which was really nice. And I really felt that as a candidate, like all of the questions were geared towards the presentation itself, except for one. And the thing about that question was, following the presentation and Q&A portion, a library administrator and someone from my search committee followed up with me after the Q&A and acknowledged that that question was out of scope and I wasn't going to be judged by my answer in any way. And this really helped me feel a lot more comfortable about how the presentation went and also my performance during the question portion, because I hadn't thought that I answered the question adequately. So I really appreciate them taking the time to affirm that for me. So overall, I was really pleased with the way that I was hired. I felt more confident throughout the interview than I would have if GBSU had gone with more traditional hiring practices. I felt like I was set up for success from the beginning. And I was given the opportunity to express my needs before and during each segment of the hiring process. The hiring process itself also demonstrated aspects of inclusion, equity, and accessibility that I look for in any work environment that I work for or want to be a part of. This made me feel more comfortable with and integrated into the work culture when I started at GBSU. It also set the precedent for collegiality rather than competition. So I felt like my colleagues were really on my team and they were intent on helping me succeed rather than competing against me. This perception made it easier for me to ask colleagues questions when I was unsure about something. So it helped me trust that my questions would be well received. And additionally, high empathy hiring practices encourage self-care and reflection, which were modeled in the work environment. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to talk about my time since GBSU. So since interviewing at GBSU, a little over 4 years have passed, and in that time, I've been on the job market 3 times. Having the inclusive hiring framework in mind, I'm going to reflect on various aspects of my hiring experience during this time. So before I begin, I do want to preface this slide by saying that I did end up accepting jobs at both of the institutions whose hiring processes made the ugly list. And I'll talk a little bit more about those decisions later. So some of the best hiring practices I witnessed included having all of my accommodations for in-person interviews paid up front. So this is not only an accessibility issue, but it's also an equity issue. If you as the employer are not paying for the interview costs up front, you're making the assumption that your candidate can pay out of pocket for these expenses until they're reimbursed. I've already gone on a rant about presentation topics, so I'll save you part 2 of that tirade and skip to my next point. The day before a full day interview, I was told I need to have minor but urgent surgery the next day. So I had to cancel my interview and ask for it to be rescheduled less than 24 hours before. The dean emailed me the following Monday to ask if I was all right and if I would be okay to do the interview that week. I was really touched that the dean had reached out and that they genuinely seemed to care. My privacy was completely respected, and also I found out after taking the job that the search committee had not shared the name of the person who asked to have their interview rescheduled at the last minute. This showed me that they were already committed to respecting boundaries and maintaining privacy for their candidates and employees. In another interview for a job that I did not accept, I was asked to pronounce my name properly to ensure that the search committee would not mispronounce it. I was also asked if I had preferred pronouns that they should use throughout the interview process. A few of the bad hiring practices that stood out to me during my searches were an overcrowded interview schedule, which caused me to be really stressed. So I felt responsible for parts of my interview going over, which is really not on the candidate, it's on the folks who are scheduling the interview to make sure that there's enough room for each section. And so I often felt really like I was actually prompting the people who were in the room with me that I'm like, oh, do I have to get to the next section of my interview? And I had no breaks. And it was actually that I think the head of the search committee was chasing me around with water bottles whenever I was switching between rooms for parts of my interview because they knew I wasn't getting breaks. I didn't have water breaks. I didn't have anything. And it was quite comical, like looking back, but like it was also very stressful for a candidate and it was very unnecessary. Another bad hiring practice that I noticed was, and I'll go into a bit more detail on this later, but where that portions of the hiring process, such as the presentation and interview questions, were fraught with institutional context, which only internal candidates would have had, which gave them an unfair advantage over me as an external candidate. Okay, so now into the ugly. During an interview dinner, I was asked about my presentation topic for the next day. I eagerly discussed how I would be presenting on an idea involving library ambassadors. So the associate dean who was at the dinner commented that he had a very specific idea about what a library ambassador was and expressed some concerns over my conceptualization. We got into a fairly civil disagreement about what library ambassadors are and aren't, and respectfully agreed to disagree. I left the interview dinner feeling shaken. I had been given a presentation topic that was fraught with institutional context, and clearly people had strong opinions about aspects of the topic. I stayed up the entire night before my interview day redoing my presentation. I didn't have an opportunity to practice it before presenting it. And by some miracle, I actually did get the job. This was actually the same job where gossip was flung about during casual portions of the interview, and the same job where the salary and benefits were not stated on the job ad. I really, really wanted the job though. It was my dream job. I really wanted to be this particular position. And I was so excited to see it posted because it's so rare that it does get posted. So I thought, what if it wasn't the perfect institution or the perfect workplace? I could teach them how to be more inclusive, right? I was completely wrong. So that brings me to job searches number 2 and 3. After the interview experience I had with that job, which ended up being honestly the worst place I've ever worked, I was really on edge. So when another dream job came up and 3 members of the search committee mispronounced my name in 3 different ways without asking for clarification, I almost dropped out of the search. I am so happy that I stuck with it because it ended up being one of the best places I ever worked. But all of this to say, first impressions really matter. Job searches are wild. You go on 2 or 3 dates with an institution and then you're expected to say yes or no to the career equivalent of moving in together long term. You better believe candidates are looking for and overanalyzing any and all red flags. So next, we're going to talk a bit about our hiring toolkit, which Annie and a few of her colleagues at GBSU had developed. So inclusive hiring may appear to take more time and planning, but they have greater outcomes in terms of candidate experience and creating ambassadors for future job searches. Hello. So every interaction with a potential candidate is helping you build a network for future recruitment. So it's also important to define what we mean when we say things like, what is a failed search? So is a failed search, is it that the failure to hire? Or what if it's the failure to hire for success? And then hiring the most likely to succeed versus the most qualified. Because most qualified compounds systematic privilege, whereas the most qualified may be most likely to succeed. So you have to weigh your definitions. So for writing inclusive job ads, you want to make sure that you don't have implicit bias with gender, and this can go either way. So for some examples of changing male bias phrasing, so changing we're looking for strong to we're looking for exceptional. Change who thrive in a competitive atmosphere to who are motivated by goals. Change candidates who are assertive to candidates who are go-getters. And then for changing female bias phrasing, some examples would be changing we are a community of concern ... to we are a team focused on ... Changing have a polite and pleasant style to are professional and courteous. Changing nurture and connect with customers to provide great customer service. So consider which adjectives and why. So for example, like, would you really be writing a job ad for energetic catalogers? Why do your catalogers need to be energetic? What exactly are they doing in their job position that requires them to be such? So your hiring manager might have an unending list of qualifications in mind for a given role, but in order to highlight your commitment to inclusion, it's important to trim the list down. That's because studies show that while men are likely to apply to jobs for which they meet only 60% of the qualifications, women are much more likely to hesitate unless they meet 100% of the listed requirements. Instead of including all of the nice to haves that a dream candidate might possess, stick to the must-haves. So what do they really need to have in order to be successful in this job? And you'll likely see your applications from women candidates increase. So if you'd still like to call out certain desired skills, but you don't really need the candidate to have them, you can soften the message with language like familiarity with, bonus points for, or if you have any combination of these skills, and then list out all of the ones that you would consider as preferred. That said, it's a good idea to cut down your long list no matter what. One study found that the average job seeker spends just 50 seconds reviewing a list before listing before deciding if it's not a good fit. So next I'm going to talk about centering candidates in ads. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're writing up a job ad is describing the opportunity for the candidate. So what are they getting out of this? So these are some examples of how to translate that. So from what you need to what the candidate gets out of it. So if you need to advance creation of learning objects, one way to phrase that so that you're framing it in what the candidate can get from this experience is opportunity to create and collaborate. So if you need learning assessment, knowledge of pedagogical best practices, you can say opportunity to lead peers in learning pedagogical best practices. And then if you need a user-focused person with excellent interpersonal skills, you can say opportunity to collaborate with peers and colleagues. So next we're gonna take a look at a sample job ad. This is actually taken from a live ad right now that's been posted by GBSU for a health sciences librarian. So if you want to go and find that ad so you can get a full example, we just kind of took some of the quick and dirty tips from that. So one of the first thing I want to point out is, of course, stating your values up front. So in the ad, it says specifically its position is for an inclusive, user-focused, and collegial librarian. So it states your values and expectations up front for the candidate. So this is what we are expecting. This is the type of work culture that we are. So explaining the opportunity for the candidate, which we talked about on the previous slide a little bit. So I didn't go into too much detail, but just some of the like active like adjective verbs, sorry, forgot English for a second, verbs that you might consider using. And if you take a look at the position description, you can see the full context for these, but this position will give the selected candidate the opportunity to create, collaborate, whatever, grow, whatever, belong, wherever, and discover. And again, if you look at the job ad, you'll see that fully fleshed out. So required qualifications also include why. So demonstrated ability to work flexibly as the position balances independent and collaborative work, as well as a mix of meeting immediate user needs and longer-term strategic work. And it also states the salary upfront, approximately 54 to 58,000, commensurate with experience. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Annie to discuss communications and interactions with candidates, as well as best practices for interviews.
Some of this I covered earlier, so I'll go through it quickly and then we can actually look at a sample. So again, depending where you're at in the process, but this presumes you're early in the process, you know, that overview of the upcoming interview, that search committee information around name, roles, pronoun, but also why are they on the committee? That can help someone situate the overall process and timeline. So what are the dates, the date ranges for the next steps? What would be included in the next rounds of interviews? How travel and bookings will occur? What information about them will be shared and how with libraries? So for example, at Grand Valley, we do not share cover letters because those are addressed to the search committee, but we do share the CVs in a limited way. Workplace values that you hold. So what are your values in action? Or if you have workplace principles, to articulate those again, because though we do not hire for fit, that's laden with privilege and systemic issues, we are an implicit bias. We do actually want to make sure that people are aware of the type of work culture that we seek to sustain, because that is part of our evaluation process. Where can they find more information about working here, right? Besides the search committee, which is obviously has a bias to try to hire them. They're going to try to show them the best side. And then how to request that accommodation, as we said earlier. And so I didn't put an ad. Sorry, that was the sample. So instead, we wanted to talk a little bit about sample questions and success criteria, because this is an area we tend to get more questions about. People are not always familiar with them. So here we have 3 different questions that are aligned with the qualification, and then what concepts a successful answer would contain. So for example, tell us about a time when someone gave input into your work. We didn't say if it was positive or negative. Some of the prompts to help a candidate that's struggling a little bit. You know, what was it? How did you respond? because in that qualification, we're looking for that ability to work independently and collaboratively. And the criteria we'll look to when someone's answering is, can they demonstrate self-reflection? Are they talking about the event, particularly if it's a negative, with a level of respect? And also, are they communicating clearly? Can they demonstrate they were hearing? And then do they have confidence? We often hire for confident humility in our library faculty members because we want them to be confident enough and know who they are, but humble enough to listen and hear others as well as they partner. Even when there's a two-part questions, right? Libraries love our long questions. So actually cueing the candidate that it's a two-part question and then explaining it. So in this case, how do you define diversity and inclusion? Can you tell us about a time when you honored the uniqueness of an individual? And we're really looking for them, what is their understanding of diversity and inclusion? Though every single one of our position has an accountability and a qualification around inclusion, we know in these cases, we're not hiring an inclusion equity lead, but we do need them to be able to see how in their own work, they are part of doing the work. So, can they apply that understanding? Do they understand the impact of this work, but also the impact they can have on others, and that they demonstrate empathy in trying to find the solution? A very standard entry-level type question, right? Helping us to understand how you prioritize. Can you tell us how you decide what amount of time is reasonable for a certain task? And so we're really there looking for strong time management skills. So again, how did they manage their time? What are their prioritization skills? Self-management at an entry level. For a more advanced position, we might also look at the awareness of impact on others. And also, are they able to seek help from a supervisor or someone else in the organization as needed? When a success criteria might be an interpretation in and of itself, define it. Make sure that the group, the search committee has really good shared understanding of that. It's unfortunate when you get into the debrief and then you start to talk about what the question meant in the first place, rather than evaluating the candidates. So for example, when I said self-management, here we defined it as well as awareness of supervisor support, knowing when to ask for help, and sharing the work. Some best practices for interactional candidates. So Preethi earlier referred that our folks have been coached. Ahead of any open search interview component, we actually send out a guide on best practices for interactions with candidates, and that their role is not only to help us, of course, they are to do some evaluation and send us feedback about them, but their primary role as future colleagues is to support a positive candidate experience and that ensure that everybody's ready to participate actively. So we want them to help us make the candidates comfortable. No matter how qualified or experienced a candidate is, we know that a job interview is a daunting situation. So as interviewers, it's important that we make them feel as comfortable and relaxed as is feasible. And some of those simple things, letting them know where they can leave their belongings safely, where the washrooms are, and not keeping them waiting between components. Particularly for the open component, we ask our folks to listen with your ears and your eyes. So we actually hand out a template that includes the topic at the top, the evaluation criteria for presentation and that presentation in particular, and then a line down the middle using our sociology backgrounds of what did they hear? And then also what did they see in terms of were the slides accessible? Was the text clear? Those types of aspects. We also want them to listen as much as they speak or more. We don't want them to oversell the role, right? We don't want people coming to us under false pretense. So while we want them to be comfortable, we also don't want to just chat with the candidates. They're there to also gain a lot of important information. And so we believe that to make the right hire, we have to run an effective interview process. And so we also want any time spent with a candidate during a campus interview considered as interview time. And so that means we need to be really intentional to avoid questions of a personal nature. Now, if a candidate brings some things up like, hey, I have children, I'd like to know about the school, of course you can engage in that. Don't just scream a legal question and run away. But that's very different than as a hiring manager saying, oh, how many children do you have, by the way? Which I may have had occur to me in a previous interview. At the time, I had none, which was actually seen as a liability because then I might be going on maternity leave soon, which in Canada, we're 12 months. Questions should really be focused on their professional experience, even in the less formal parts of an interview, unless they are leading that process. And we also give them actually a little guide about how they, as peers, should ask questions that don't require local experience. So I put on the slide an example of BEST. How do you envision providing service from different locations? Okay, how should downtown branches offer services? Presumes knowledge that downtown tends to be urban mix, that we have downtown branches. At least, how should the Fry Library change its service in the next 3 years, which presumes knowledge that Fry is a health library, the location and environment of Fry, and the programmatic and curricular changes for Fry. If you want more, as Preethi said, the full toolkit is on Grand Valley ScholarWorks, and it includes actual full samples of communications and job ads and other aspects. So it is now time for questions. And the slides for today are available on ScholarWorks. So I'm going to stop sharing and see what questions all of you might have. Oh. Yes. What other questions while I get that link?
Hi, Annie. My name is Tori Kellogg, and instead of writing my question in chat, I thought I would just pop on and ask it directly. Have you all limited the number of candidates you look at based on your applicant pool? We're recruiting right now, and I'm interested to know, for example, let's say your pool that was turned over from you from HR, let's say had 40 people in it. Do you all designate, like, we're going to screen out people who don't meet minimum qualifications so you can get down to, let's say, 10 candidates, right, that you would bring in, or how do you all handle that type of process? Thank you.
We do limit our pools typically. So we try to do multiple job hires at a time if we can, because that provides candidates more experience. So that's why I'm sharing that first, because it depends. Typically, we try to do a phone interview component ahead of a visit. Though with the pandemic, it's been a phone component ahead of a longer Zoom component. Typically for the phone, we try to limit it to 8 if there's one job. If all the, sometimes we'll do up to 10. And those interviews are at most 50 minutes. So generally for entry level, we keep them at 30-minute interviews. And so that would be 15 to 20 minutes of our questions and at least 10 minutes for the candidate. And then we put a 15-minute break in between, because I want, not only search committee members also need bio breaks and water breaks, but I also actually want, after each search on the template, I want them to note areas of strength for the candidate and areas of growth for the candidate before they move on to the next candidate and start to blur or compare. And then if it's multiple job, then we'll add +4. So if there's 2 jobs, we might do 12 for phone. And then on campus, we try to limit it to 3 per position, 4 if they're extremely strong and very, sometimes you have 2 strong and then the 3rd and the 4th are very similar, and then you're flipping a coin, we'll include the 4th. Because sometimes the people on paper are not the strongest. Go ahead, Tori.
I was going to say thank you, and I'm glad you mentioned 2, because we are now recruiting for 2 positions, and I kind of had a similar idea in my head that I wanted to look at least 20 of people in the applicant pool, because one of the other issues we have, and I see someone talk about salaries in chat, is we have no control. As the hiring team over salaries is set by the HR, but there is a range there, and so we've had the unfortunate situation in the past where we've selected a candidate, HR have offered them the salary, and they've declined the salary, right? And so declined the position, but we didn't look at enough people initially. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to avoid with this go round. Thank you so much.
No, and that's helpful. And if you have any wiggle room with HR, I like to do the offers myself, for at least for faculty and librarian positions.
And we have no wiggle room with HR, unfortunately. Yes. Hiring for faculty positions, but that's just a policy of the college, that all of that salary information is handled through HR and based on the collective bargaining agreement. So we just have a little flexibility there, but thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely. Allison, I know, is looking at questions for us. So
Sure, I'll go ahead and try to read these in the order that they were submitted. So the next question says, if there is time, I would love to hear, have you applied or might you apply these guidelines to student positions or internships?
Yeah, so for internships and practicums, we actually use the same hiring practices. They're more succinct, so we tend to just do phone for those. And we do advertise salary. We do not, currently in my library, we do not support any unpaid opportunities. That was a choice for us to uphold equity. We are currently working on how we bring all of this to our student colleagues. So hopefully more news forthcoming.
Thanks, Annie. So the next question says, do you ever approach applicants who apply but are not chosen based on their cover letter or other materials who might need mentorship or other guidance?
Yeah, and if there's questions you want to jump in as well, please do. The answer is sometimes. So because we've already shared information, invited them for questions, folks may reach out and then we will honor that. If we know the candidates in any way, shape, or form, we will also offer that support. And there's sometimes where we've seen a candidate apply a few times for us and they are meeting the minimum, but their material is not there. We might follow up and offer that support as well. So sometimes that's a question of scale, but we have seen candidates that we've coached be successful later on in at least getting adjunct positions. So visiting sort of 6-month positions with us, which is a start, not necessarily the dream.
Okay, thank you. So the next question says, do you have suggestions for when you want to do an assignment that feels authentic, especially for more technical jobs, but also ensure it's not free labor?
So I can answer this one. So my best advice would be to make sure it's not fraught with institutional context. So I think it's totally fine to come up with an abstract idea for a presentation, especially for more technical positions or where people will be you need to see the demonstration of how they would go about solving a particular problem. In which case, like I would just say make sure that someone who has no knowledge of your institution would be able to be successful answering that question. And if there is any institutional context, make sure you provide it to them. I do think if possible, no institutional context is the best, like no need for any institutional context is the best way to go, because even if you think you're providing them with all the context they need, you might still be privileging your internal candidates.
Thank you. So the next question says, my institution currently does not post salaries for faculty positions because it is an institutional rule that no faculty salaries ranges are posted. Any suggestions on going about helping to make the process more transparent?
My suggestion is first, though, anchored in the fact that I have a bias to action and I'm willing to take informed risk. I used to have the same policy that I worked under at Grand Valley. But however, I worked closely with HR, legal services, and the provost office to get some wiggle room. And at first they allowed me to post it in external searches. And now it's become standard practice for the library and increasingly others to post those. Now, before I had that approval, the libraries created a hiring FAQ that we would link to in our ads under the Discover More. And in that was a question of what can I expect my salary to be? And that's where I would put the range. So it was kind of a 2-step dance. It was not perfect, but it did at least, when Preethi was hired, that's how salary was stated back then. So I don't know, Preethi, if you have thoughts on other tools or maverick moves.
Yeah, so I think just maybe giving this is a little sneaky, but I feel like giving the contact information for someone they can reach out to ask questions about salary and benefits is also good. And if I were the person they were reaching out to, especially if I worked at a state institution, I would send them back the like transparent salary lists so they could see what everyone else is going to be making in their department. So when they go to negotiate, they're not going in without any context. If you don't work at a state institution, then I just wonder if you are able to have a phone conversation with that person and just tell them up front, like, this is normally what we offer. I think there are ways around it, and I would hope that we would be able to accommodate that somehow.
I see Julianne's question about tips and suggestions for hiring non-librarians. We use the same process for non-librarians or paraprofessionals and unionized staff, but we make the components smaller. So our search committees, instead of being capped at 5, are capped at 3. All of our search committees include an inclusion advocate who's there to support the search and equity process, but also be the advocate on behalf of the candidate throughout the process. So for our unionized position, which are entry-level frontline, we cap it at 3 people, so that's more human scaled. There's a search component. There are no open component typically in those job searches, but there is a meeting with library administration so that they can ask questions about our culture, our leadership, get to meet us. And in some cases, for the administrative profession, which are bachelor's required positions in my institution, we will keep the committees to 4, and there will be open components if that is relevant to the job. And they will, of course, meet with the team that they would report to or report in or oversee, depending on the position. So a lot of what we talked about is transferable to other employment positions besides librarians. That intentional, deliberate approach to how you write your ads and what component the search should include all translate well.
So I think we're at time, Annie and Preethi. I think I'll defer to you both for next steps.
So I posted our emails in the chat, just in case you had questions that didn't get answered. Please feel free to email Annie and I. We're more than happy to answer any questions offline. We're so happy to see so many of you are interested in implementing inclusive hiring. That's so great.
Thank you, everyone. And if you have questions, both Preethi and I are on Twitter, and our inboxes are open. So thank you for joining us today and learning about this important topic.